Invitation. And let me just share with you, I was supposed to be out here on the 23rd of January, I think it was. And on the 18th of January, I walk into the doctor's office for a routine visit and walk out of there having found out that I had had a heart attack. And so that began about a month's worth of hiatus. I basically didn't do anything for the next month. I had to have a heart cath, and thankfully all of that checked out good, and they've diagnosed my issue as stress and high blood pressure. So blood pressure wasn't being treated properly. So I'm basically freed up now and able to go back to my normal life, and the eldership where I preach is kind of backed off on a lot of my responsibilities and given me that space to kind of catch my breath. And so I'm very thankful. It's been a weird year. We had that happen, and my living room flooded, and we had $33,000 worth of damage to our house, and it's just been a year, and we're only into April. So hopefully the rest of the year is just going to smooth out. So I'm very thankful, as always, for the opportunity to be here with you. And my name is Matthew Allen. I preach in Dayton, Ohio, Centerville, Ohio, to be more specific, at the Cornerstone Church of Christ. And I have been coming to Grinnell now since 1996. So almost, we're within sight of 30 years. Our daughter was 6 weeks old when we came here the first time, and she is going to graduate from graduate school in 3 weeks. So pretty amazing story. So she's going to be a physical therapist. We're very proud of her. So how long do I have this morning, this first session? What, 10:30? I have as long as I want? Well, I'll be conscious of that. I want to share with you a little bit about my history as we talk about Christians in the culture. I came up of age in the 80s and 90s. I grew up in a small town down in Arkansas. It's about halfway between Little Rock and Texarkana. And Malvern is where I grew up, and it's known as the brick capital of the world. It's about 10,000 people. And when I was growing up, it was a small-knit community, and from everything I hear, it still is a small town. And this is the house I grew up in. I took this shot a couple years ago when I was back for a visit, and I knew just about everybody on my street. I knew the guy down on the corner. His name was Clint Fuller. And he was a referee, and he was the referee for the Southwest Conference, and he traveled all over Arkansas and Texas doing football games, and when he was lucky, he'd get to a Razorback game. And so we knew him, and my two neighbors on either side of us were widow ladies, and they both went to First Baptist Church. We knew everybody, and they knew us. If a person didn't know you, then they certainly knew who your parents were. This is my mom and dad back in the 80s. And they knew your grandparents, they knew your parents, they knew your aunts and uncles. They would have known, this is my grandparents on the night before I got married. And this is my beautiful grandmother, my dad's mom, on the day of our marriage. They knew who you were. And everybody was connected in some way. In the days before Walmart began selling groceries, everybody would gather here at the food center downtown in Malvern. And my uncle still works there. And this is him and my mom from a year or two ago. And I can remember as a kid walking through the store and all the aisles of the store. It's your old typical supermarket, right? I can remember people standing in the aisles, talking to each other, catching up on their families and what was going on in their lives. And just everybody knew everybody. It was just one of those perfect small town communities. One of the things I'd remembered, and my wife kind of laughed at this, everybody that lived there in Hot Spring County just about had lived there their whole life. And I remember when people would move in, that we always thought that was a big deal. People moving into the county, and we were always amazed at why anybody would ever want to leave. Why would you ever want to leave here? This is the best place in the world to live. We took it personal when somebody would do that. Our community growing up was safe. I could ride my bike literally all over town. I just left in the morning in the summer and was gone. And Mom and Dad would have had no idea where I was, but they knew If something happened, somebody would know who I was, and I'd be okay. We'd be taken care of. I remember time in the summer out fishing with friends and floating the river and being out in the woods with your 22 or your 410. That was just part of life. I can remember pulling up to my high school in the late 80s, early 90s with trucks. It was mainly trucks out in the parking lot where we all parked, and all those trucks had a shotgun back in the back. We were ready to go hunting, as soon as certain times of the year, as soon as it was done. That was just life. In Malvern in 1986, it was a scandal when Walmart opened for the first time on Sunday. You remember, maybe this happened in your town where you grew up, I don't know, but it was a big, big deal. I remember when I was a boy, junior high, high school, no school activity was ever scheduled on Wednesday night and never on a Sunday. Everybody understood that was church time. And at least in Hot Spring County, Christian influence was everywhere you went. Now, that doesn't mean that everything was perfect. There were dishonest people. This is the little church where I grew up. It's still there. Still about 20, 25 people worship there. And my dad, this was in the 80s, my dad was a deputy sheriff, and Dad could tell you about all the dishonest people that were in the county. We had liquor stores that dotted the county line. Our county was dry. But there were broken marriages. There were abused kids. Racism was a thing. People went to jail. The churches had their scandals. But I'll tell you this. It was a great place to grow up. And looking back, I am who I am today because of the people. I don't know how well you can see that picture, but that was the local church where I grew up, all the Christians in Malvern in 1994. My dad's over there on the right. Becky's there in the middle. You can see her behind me. And then Mike Cornwell, who I think preached out here in Grinnell back in the 90s or 2000s. Mike is there. He was our located preacher. But this is where I grew up, and these people were the Christians that I grew up around, and I'm so blessed because of them. But brothers and sisters, the world that we live in today is so different. The way of life that I remember growing up is so different. It seems back then it was so much simpler and so much more innocent. And so as we look at our culture today, what we see is a world that we hardly recognize because it hardly resembles anything of our past American culture. So many things have changed. And we wonder sometimes how much further things can go before the world just falls apart. Our world seems to be running farther and farther away from God. And we wonder what's going to happen when the day comes that we're going to have to stand up and publicly affirm immorality just to be accepted in society. That day may be coming. We look around and we see all these things that are happening. We may be pressured. They're going to be under significant pressure to say things or agree with things that we fundamentally disagree with. Well, my son is 22. He's just moving out of our house here in a couple weeks. But one of the things I've noticed with my son over the last 10 years or so, Zach really thinks that one day this country is going to dissolve. He is prepared. He says, I may have to fight to preserve my freedom right here. Why are our kids growing up thinking there's going to be a civil war? This is the world we live in. This is not the same place that all of us grew up in. I think about it in this way. Right today, we are more educated than we've ever been. We are wealthier than we've ever been. We have instantaneous access to far more information than we could ever process. It's right at our fingertips. And so what's the result of that? In large part, we're impatient, we're selfish, we're arrogant, we think we know more than we do, and it's a problem in our culture. And really, I look back, our communities have changed. They are much different than they were 30 years ago. Christianity now is just one religion of many inside of our communities. In some places, it feels like Christianity has become something that's of a growing minority, especially if you intend on applying biblical principles to your life. And no, this is really not the first time that something like this has happened in our history. But I think it is the first time in this country that Christians are finding themselves living in active resistance to and the wholesale rejection of Christianity at large. That is happening all around us. And so I think many of the values that we took for granted years ago, just a few short decades ago, are now being lost to the passage of time. Think about it. Our children today that go to public school are being confronted with immorality on a scale that you and I could never have imagined when we were growing up. They are being told to question biblical values. They are being shamed into thinking that those who believe in Christianity and Christian morality, they're being told that Christians have dark hearts, who are nothing more than racist bigots and nationalists who are just mad that their time of exclusivism has passed. That's what our kids are being told. And I will tell you, it's having a tremendous impact on the church. So I want you to think about this. And now, the last 20 years, 19 to be exact, I've preached in 2 large Midwestern cities in the suburbs, upper middle income, upperly mobile people, professional white-collar communities, larger congregations, fully supporting, established elderships, deacons, all of the bells and whistles, right? And I can tell you, in both of those congregations over the last 20 years, the loss rate of our young people is between 50 and 60%. At Kettering/Cornerstone, where I've been the last 12 years, our rate is at 60% of the young people since 2010 to today. I just did the numbers a couple of weeks ago. We've lost 60% of our kids. 60%. And so and what I'm finding is that's typical within the churches of Christ. I don't care, non-institutional, mainstream, whatever it is, that's the number. And at younger and younger ages, our young people are facing issues on the existence of God. They are dealing with the validity and authority of Scripture. They're being challenged with sexual morality and those types of issues, gender issues, the legalization of drugs and cohabitation. And so as we observe the world around, it really feels as if young minds are not only being swayed, but they are being fundamentally and permanently changed. And so the question before us all today is, how do we respond? How can the church engage the culture? Because if we do not respond, brothers and sisters, in the right way, a generation from now, the church is going to look much different than it does today. There will be many congregations that are in existence today that will not be in existence in 20 years if we don't respond now in the proper way. So the question really comes down to this: how do we respond? I want to share with you that I think the first need in responding is to understand that a very new reality has come upon us. And that is this: Christianity, in large part, is no longer in the majority. Now, this is going to impact us emotionally. And I think we've probably all gone through this a little bit. As we're impacted emotionally, I think, first of all, we're going to go through a sense of shock and awe and maybe some anxiousness about the future. You know, I go through spurts. How many of you watch the news regularly? Okay, so I kind of go like this. And what happens with me is I reach a point where I just can't handle it anymore. And I've got to turn it off. I used to go to watch sports, but you can't even watch sports now without politicization. All right, so then you go to the Discovery Channel, and we've got all this stuff about climate change and politics. And finally, you know, it's just turn off the TV and go outside. I mean, seriously. I watch the news some. I read some of the papers. I don't know how to respond. And there's all sorts of different emotions we feel. And you know what was interesting? I put this study together. I got to thinking about, you ever heard that there's 5 stages of grief? Well, like when you lose a loved one in your family, you kind of go through, and they've actually did some research on this back in the 60s, and there's been books and papers written on 5 stages of grief. And I thought, I wonder if Christians in 2022 are going through and in some part of the stages of grief in dealing with how the culture has changed, and it's a new reality upon us. For example, as I said a moment ago, sometimes we may go through times of shock and denial. So we read the paper, we listen to the news, we look at all these things, and we see these things, and they're just shocking. They're just shocking. And we don't know how to respond. We may be filled with fear and anxiety. And really what happens in this stage is we may want to hold on to a reality that no longer exists. Our thoughts continually go back to the past, and we think about better times and better situations, and we emotionally try to reject the truth that is right in front of us. And so we ignore the problem. We turn off the TV, we quit reading the magazines, we get off social media, we just unplug. I know a lot of people that are doing that. But we try to convince ourselves that everything that's changing around us is not going to impact us. I'm just going to get out here to myself and leave it all alone. That's one stage. Then there may be another stage that we deal with, and that's anger and depression. So things keep progressing, and it finally reaches a point where we cannot ignore it anymore. So we decide to fight back against our fear, and we tend to start blaming others. We start blaming ideologies that we disagree with. We turn to stereotypes. We lash out at people we disagree with. And I'll tell you where I'm finding this to happen the most, it's out on social media. I've almost had to quit on Facebook. Twitter's even worse. Because of the way Christians handle themselves on social media. And look, I am preaching myself because I have struggled with this. I mean, I have just about the last 2 years quit posting on politics because it's gotten so divisive. So divisive. But we get angry. We get depressed. We express that anger. And I'll tell you what, you can get really angry on social media and tell everybody exactly how you feel or whatever. And I'll tell you, your post on Facebook has never changed not one mind. Not one mind. No one has ever changed their mind when we stick it to everybody else about what we think. But we get suspicious. We get skeptical. We start revealing our frustration, and lower we sink. And we begin to believe there's no way that this is ever going to change. We all feel overwhelmed. We isolate ourselves. I mean, we talk about moving somewhere else. I got friends that are saying, I'm moving to Belize. I'm moving somewhere else. I'm getting out of here. Well, there's another stage that we may go through too with this, and that's the acceptance and integration. And this is where we finally, after so long, come to terms with reality. We begin to accept things for the way they are. And I'll tell you, I think it's time that maybe after 45 years of this, we finally admit we've lost the culture war. And that's okay. We have to be okay with it. Because we've got to move on from this constant negativity. We need to accept the reality of what's going on. We need to learn to work within that change that is happening, work within it instead of working against it. Because what happens when we work against it, we just get crushed. So we need to get to the point where we begin to look for new opportunities, move in faith and hope and trust. So the lesson today, as we talk about engaging modern culture, I think it's important that we, before we go any further, that we define what we're talking about when we talk about living in the culture. So when I use that word, culture, each one of you probably have differing definitions of that. What do we mean? Sometimes we use the word culture and we're talking about the arts, and we're talking about classical music and refined things, right? Sometimes we use the word culture, we're talking about what's on TV. We're talking about movies. We're talking about, pop culture, reality TV, that part of culture. And then finally, there's another definition that some people use when it comes to culture. They're using it to describe worldliness. Culture becomes this word that we just use to kind of drop everything in that we're against. All right? So we talk about immoral lifestyles, liberal politics, social agendas, whatever it is. And we just use that word as a catch-all term to put it all in. So really, two definitions that I think we want to talk about here when we talk about culture. Basically, it is what people do with the world. Culture is what people do with the world. And another definition I came across in another book is anything humans produce when they interact with each other and God's creation. So broadly speaking, when we talk about culture, we are talking about the totality of life in our world. And culture is something that is constantly changing. Culture has a way of repeating itself. So I grew up in the 80s, like junior high, 1986, 87, all right? Now, for some of you, that's like, oh, that wasn't that long ago. Others are going, wow, that guy is really old. But the thing was in the 80s, at least where I grew up, we would take our pants and we would twist them around like this, and then we'd roll them up, and they'd look just, you know, do you remember doing that? Well, you know what? I think some of that's coming back. All right, 80s style clothes are back. It's cool, it's hip, you know. 10 years ago, the 70s repeated. I'm glad we got through the 70s again the second time. Sorry, Pat and Donna. I mean, you know, things repeat itself. Think about the way that we use language. The word right now is fire. That's fire. Have you heard that? Well, if you have a 20-year-old in your house, you heard it. And we had our former second preacher just left us a few months ago. I had come into the office, I had a new shirt and a vest on, one of these little zip-up vests without the sleeves, you know. And he walks in my office and he looks at me and says, "You look fresh." Whoa! Now, for the 20-year-old crowd, I guess that's the word. For me, no. No. I don't look fresh, okay? All right, but words change, right? I mean, to me, I hear these kids say, "That's so fire. That's fire." I'm like, fire? Okay, all right. Things change. So culture's dynamic. In 15 years, fire will not be used that way. All right? It's just not. What one generation considers normal, the next generation looks at that as odd or funny. And so culture is all the time impacted by those that influence it. For example, songwriters and artists, books, TVs, documentaries, entrepreneurs, marketers, multi-billion-dollar corporations, educators in the post-secondary world, institutions, government, media, all of these things influence culture. Family influences culture, and then the church. Now, did you catch that? Where'd I list the church? Because that's what's happened with our church. Used to be a generation or two ago, it used to be much higher up on the list in how it impacted the culture. Now, it's hardly at all. So which of these things, as I just listed, which of these influences have become less and less of an influence over your lifetime? Well, definitely it's probably the church. So here's the very practical parts. We get into the meat of our lesson this morning. How should the Christian relate to the culture? How should the Christian relate to the culture? I had a book that I did some research on for this. It's by Bruce Ashford. And one of the perspectives of how we deal with culture, he describes it as this: Christians against the culture. And this is probably something that a lot of local congregations, this is the perspective that a lot of local congregations have probably taken over the last 20 years. He describes this viewpoint as viewing the church as a bomb shelter. And the idea is that you protect or even withdraw from the culture at large. And so there's a lot of good intentions behind that in some way, because I think there's some biblical principles there. We are in the world but not of the world, right? And by the way, we have been called as sons and daughters of God to be holy and pure. We're told to protect ourselves against ungodly influences, like this passage here in Hebrews 12:14. Pursue peace with everyone and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. And then this passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, since we have these promises, let us cleanse ourselves from every impurity of the flesh and spirit, bringing holiness to completion in the fear of God. And then this passage in 1 Peter 1, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the desires of your former ignorance, but as the one who called you is holy, you also are to be holy in all your conduct, for it is written, be holy, for I am holy. So we have these passages like this that would seem to lend itself to, I need to stand against the culture. And it is very true that the church should be a place of refuge and protection, a place where we can be spiritually healed, renewed, and refreshed. And I tell you, I hope this church, when you walk into this room together, this is a place of hope and renewal and encouragement and help. A place of refuge from the world. It's a place we come to be recharged and energized. But brothers and sisters, I want you to understand this. The battle is not in our buildings. The battle's out in the world. And what has happened is, in a lot of places, congregations have brought the battle inside their building, and all they do is fuss and fight and get mad at each other and divide and split, and we can't have fellowship with anybody else but those that we exactly agree with. And what happens is our numbers keep diminishing. You know, I tell you, if you have a certain attitude about the way people need to agree with everything you believe, before long, you're not going to be with anybody but yourself. I couldn't even worship my wife, because she's wrong on a lot of things. She's not here to defend herself today. You know what she'd tell you? Is I'm wrong on a lot of things too. Look, every congregation has got to learn to work together. The battle's not in our buildings, brothers. The battle is out in the world. And we must never retreat inside our buildings and just wait for the world to come to an end. More than ever, the battle is raging outside, and we need to see ourselves as vessels that transmit the power of Jesus to change hearts and minds. Now, look with me in John 17 for just a moment. This is John 17. This is 14 through 16. Listen to what Jesus says. He says, I have given them your word. The world hated them because they are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. I am not praying that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. Listen to 16. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. Now, there's two things that I want you to see from these verses. First of all, we are in the world, but we're not of it. Do you see that there? We're in the world, but not of it. So, isolation is not an option. I can't pick myself up and remove myself from this world. And the other thing I want you to see from this as we think about this, Christianity is not only about militant resistance. If I frame Christianity as being against the culture, then I view everything from the world primarily from the viewpoint or standpoint of war. And yes, we are at war. I get that. Paul told Timothy to fight the good fight of faith. But I want to stress this to you. Spiritual warfare is not the totality of our existence. Brothers and sisters, when you look out into the world, I want you to see lost people who are in need of a Savior, not the enemy. Lost people who are in need of a Savior. Listen, we have been left here by God. Do you know the reason why the Lord has not returned yet? Because there are still people to save. He has left us here to help people. And so just like Jesus, we need to have a heart for the lost, and we need to be willing to exhibit the love of the Father. So Christians against the culture is one perspective of how we go forward. The other perspective is really this: Christians in and for the culture. Now, I want to take you back to this John 17 passage. And when I read this passage, this here is really the essence of what it means to be in and for the culture. This passage teaches us that we don't withdraw, we don't lead lives of fear and isolation. We look for opportunities to engage the culture where we can. We view ourselves as representatives of Christ, where we live for the good of others. Now, how do we do that? Well, we do it by keeping in step with the Spirit. We do it by desiring to bring glory to Jesus and provide effective testimony for the gospel of Jesus Christ. Listen, all around us we see people that are worshiping themselves. They're worshiping sex, they're worshiping money, they're worshiping power, they're worshiping anything other than God. And it is our job to speak against these things, but from the perspective of providing help. Not condemnation, not judgment, but help. I want to help them see a different way. That's what we mean by living for the culture. We speak out for their sake. We point the way to healing. We are there to help them. We show them how to redirect their lives. Christians bring solutions, not condemnation and judgment. And by the way, that's the message of Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount. Go back and read Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Matthew 5, he says, you are the salt of the earth. What does salt do? Salt is a preservative. Salt preserves all that is good and right and wholesome. We are doing that as sons and daughters of God. Verse 14 through 16 of Matthew 5, he says, you are the light of the world. What are we? We are the way that points out and away from sin. We always point back to the source, and that is Almighty God. So we are for the culture. We are trying there to serve and help them. So as we move into the last part of this part of the lesson, I want to talk about our directive in responding to the culture. I want to take you to 2 Corinthians. And this is the charge for the church as we go into the rest of the 2020s, and it's the charge of the church for every time, all time, every era. We may have missed it at some point in the past. It's time to get back to this. And the charge here in 2 Corinthians 5 is, you go forward, Christian, with the ministry of reconciliation. So look first at verse 17, 2 Corinthians 5, 17. This verse, it begins from the understanding of our identity. Do you see it? What are we as Christians? How are we defined? We are a new creation. And so that fact, I am a new creation, that is the baseline of understanding behind everything that I do as a son or daughter of God. I am a new creation. I am not who I was. I am new. I am God's. I am a son or daughter of God. And the newness that he is talking about here in this passage is the result of being in Christ. Now, I want you to look at verse 18. There's three things from verses 18 and 19 that I want to focus on. First of all, here in verse 18, it is God's intention to reconcile sinners to himself through Christ. Do you see that? In verse 18, everything is from God who has reconciled us to himself through Christ. All right? God wants to reconcile sinners to himself through Christ. That's verse 18a. And then I want you to see here as we go in, he's given us a message of reconciliation. Now in verse 19, upon that reconciliation, what has God done? Look at the last part of the verse. He has committed the message of reconciliation to us. Now, what is Paul saying? He is saying my mission, your mission, not just the preachers, not just the shepherds, not just the deacons, not just certain learned men of the congregation, everyone's mission within the local church, the focus is outward. He has given us the ministry of reconciliation. The focus is outward, toward the lost. It is service-based. And notice here, if you look here, he has committed the message. We've been given a message. And by the way, that word message here, if you go back and just look in the original language, and I'm not a Greek scholar, and nor did I sleep in a Holiday Inn Express last night, so I am not really, I am not a big Greek person or authority, but I'm dangerous with it. And the word here for message is the word for gospel. That's pretty cool. It's the word for gospel. And so the mission of every Christian is to get the gospel out to as many people as possible. And so going on from here, he uses the imagery of an ambassador. Look at verse 20. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, since God is making his appeal through us. Ambassadors. Everybody understand what an ambassador is? Well, it's a place of honor and dignity where the person travels to a foreign land and represents the government in that place. And so what the apostles are doing here, and they will use this imagery throughout the writing of the New Testament. Paul talked in many places about how we are citizens of heaven and we dwell in a foreign land. Peter uses that language throughout 1 Peter, strangers and aliens in a foreign land. The apostles go out of their way to stress this world is not our home. But while we are here, the message is that we proclaim the message of reconciliation representing our King. We carry the words that we've been given to speak. We speak Jesus by his revealed word. And listen, as we speak, it is not our job to change the culture. Think about what I just said. As we speak, it is not our job to change the culture. What is our mission? Our mission is to represent Christ who sent us. That's what we do. That's our mission. And so today, as we move in and around the culture, we're going to encounter people who need to be rescued. And we share with them the message of how they can be saved, how they can be rescued. Listen, we're going to get to know unbelievers. I started this lesson by recounting to you small town Arkansas in the 80s. You know, in Hot Spring County, I don't hardly ever remember coming in contact with a person that did not believe in God. I don't remember. I mean, I'm sure there were. I didn't know everybody in the county. But I knew a lot of people. It wasn't until probably the last 10 or 15 years where I've heard more and more people that just deny the existence of God. There was always people in academia and whatever else that didn't, but I'm just saying it seems like it's never been on such a large scale in this country of people that just totally deny the existence of God, and where it's so openly and unapologetically taught in our schools. We're going to get to know unbelievers. Are we prepared to answer the basic questions on the existence of God? Well, we're gonna meet people who are trapped in porn. We're doing a class right now at Cornerstone for men. We have these little small groups we call CAST groups, coming alongside together groups is what the acronym stands for. We have about 12 men that we're going through and studying. And I tell you what, statistics tell us that probably 70 to 80% of the men in congregations are trapped in porn. Maybe more. And women too. Maybe not that high for women, but it's there. How are we responding to these issues? We're going to meet people that are struggling with same-sex attraction. We have people coming right now at Cornerstone that are transgender kids. We have a new family that's come in. They're very evangelistic. They're always inviting their friends from school to church. And we've had a transgender, I don't know which way, I don't remember. It doesn't matter. We've had a transgender person coming to church with us for probably the last year. And we're just trying to love on this person and get to know them and encourage them so that we'll have a relationship where hopefully down the line we can help them see the gospel. You're going to have women that come in that have had multiple abortions. You're going to have people come in that have changed their gender, broken people. And so listen, how are we going to respond to that? When we speak the message of reconciliation, we need to let others know that we love them. And we want to encourage them enough to show them that there is a way out of their sin and a way to access forgiveness through Jesus Christ. Listen, we need to speak from the perception of care and love and concern. And listen, we got to give up on politics. We have a family that moved down to our congregation from another one in the area within the last year. And these people are political conservatives by and far. But what they told me was one of the things that drove them to leave where they were was that their church had become the church of Fox News. And if you didn't agree with them exactly on their political positions, then you were made to feel very uncomfortable. That's happening. We got to keep the politics out of it. Listen, I'm old enough to remember the late 70s and early 80s with the moral majority. Do you remember that? You had Jerry Falwell and, I don't know, Pat Robertson and I'm probably, what was the dude that, the Jimmy, who? Jim Baker. Yes. Remember that? PTL Club or whatever. But anyway, all those guys got in bed with the politicians. And what were we told? Oh, if you will elect these politicians, they're going to go and they're going to pass all these laws that are going to put Christian values and morals back in the culture, and the country's going to be saved, and it's going to be great. What have we been told over the last 40 years about abortion? If you just elect this candidate, you just elect this one, he's going to put the right people in the Supreme Court, and abortion's going to go away. Brothers and sisters, how many times over the last 30 years have we had the Republicans, I'll just point out them for a moment. We had the Republicans in that tell us we're going to get rid of abortion. They've had the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And we still got abortion. When are we going to learn that we've been used? The answer is not in politics. The answer is not in more laws. The answer is in the Word of God. And it's not my mission to make sure Donald Trump is reelected or whatever your Republican governor is here in Iowa, which I think I like. What is it, Joni Ernst? Is that her name? Or that's the senator. Okay, yeah. Anyway, doesn't matter. That's not my job. My job is to be a Christian and preach the message of reconciliation because I am a citizen of a higher country, a higher calling, an eternal country. What did Jesus say? My kingdom is not of this world. That's us. We're not of this world. We're in the world, but we're not of the world. So, as we close, how many of you remember April 20th, 1999? Some of you, not much. April 20th, 1999. It was the day of the Columbine shooting. I can tell you where I was. Becky and I had Mike and Faye Cornwell out to Yellowstone National Park that day, for a few days. And we were driving back across Wyoming back to South Dakota where we lived. And I remember the news coming on, talking about the Denver shooting. And I remember We were listening to KOA out of Denver, and every news break we would listen to, it was just shock and awe. Could not believe it. We were sitting there in the van in stunned silence. We could not figure out, we could not comprehend the gravity of what had happened. And I remember how the country was still in shock weeks afterward. Do you remember that? And yet today we've almost become numb to mass shootings. I mean, I want to share this story with you. A few years after the Columbine shooting, a man walked into a one-room Amish schoolhouse in Pennsylvania and murdered 5 young girls aged 6 to 13. Then he turned the gun on himself and killed himself. How the Amish community responded in the aftermath of that is absolutely amazing, and it's something we need to take note of. The parents of the deceased girls reached out to the mother of the shooter and prayed for her. The day that the shooting happened, an Amish man literally took the father of the shooter in his arms while he grieved over what his son had done. 30 people from the Amish community showed up to attend the funeral of the shooter and soon set up a charitable fund for his family since he left behind a wife and 3 children. One Amish woman said, quote, "We can tell people about Christ and actually show you in our walk that we are forgiven. We don't just say it, but we show it in our walk of life. You know you have to live it, you just can't say it." That Amish community in Pennsylvania shines out as a bright light with its loving and grace-filled response. It was Christianity in action. There's a huge lesson that our congregations need to pick up from this. It's the ministry of reconciliation. It's what Paul was talking about in 2 Corinthians 5. And so I leave you with this. We need to commit ourselves that we're going to be people that offer solutions. We are not going to be people that build walls. We're going to be people that open up our arms. We're not going to make enemies. We're going to be people that live in and for the culture. So that's all I've got for this segment. I just want to throw this out to you. We did a whole series at Cornerstone last year on this, Christians and the culture. And we had a book published that details every lecture that we gave through the summer with men like Don Truex, Roger Schaus, Max Dawson, Ken Welliver. There was a number of other people that came that I can't think of off the top of my head, but if you'd be interested, all the videos from that conference are on our website. We urge you. We talked about Christian politics, Christian and transgenders, Christian and race, Christian and higher education, just a whole bunch of stuff. And those are good resources that you ought to tap into. You can get it at our website. Thanks, everybody.